Hey guys, it's J.Anthony. Welcome back to my channel. Hey, thank you so much for all the continued support and comments I've been getting. I always really appreciate that. As always, I read all those comments. I may not get the chance to respond to them all, but this video is a direct response to some of the comments I've been getting. Within the last week, there was definitely a theme that I noticed. There was quite a few of you that were asking questions on vintage watches. And I did make an attempt in a previous video on buying pre-owned watches to kind of get into that. There was some fair criticism on that video, as vintage watches and buying a pre-owned watch can be very different things. One is a couple-year-old watch, or a modern watch, versus buying something that's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. And I get that those are very different markets. And this is a very broad topic because vintage watches, the era, you can spend decades in so-called vintage. A watch from the 70s is vintage, as a watch from the 30s or 40s is, and if you've watched my channel, I have watches from like the 1890s even. So it's a very broad topic, but I do want to address it. I want you guys, I guess, kind of have some of my perspective on it. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. So I'll transition in just a sec. I'll pull a couple of my vintage pieces out. If you've watched my channel, I have reviewed quite a few vintage pieces on my channel, just some top ones you might want to go look at. My Pierce chronograph. I had that vintage Rolex date. I have the Omega Constellation up there. I have some vintage Seikos on my channel. There's quite a few videos on vintage watches, but hopefully this video will be helpful for you. I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the points that I look at when I'm evaluating a vintage piece, and just kind of things to be aware of. So I'll cut this intro short. I know I've gotten some feedback I talk too much in these beginnings, so thanks so much for watching, and let's go take a look at some vintage watches, and I'll give you some of my key points. All right, thanks. Let's check it out. All right, guys, welcome to my office. So what I've done is I've come up with a couple key vintage pieces from my collection, and I'm going to go through them with you. I'll change camera perspectives in just a sec. But I feel like these are going to kind of represent a broad range of the different kinds of watches you can expect to find out in the field. So I have a vintage pocket watch we can look at. I have some vintage Seikos, a vintage Swiss Pierce chronograph. And again, hopefully these will all be helpful for you. Again, vintage watches are such a broad topic. There's very many different pieces, but hopefully what I'm about to show you here will be very helpful. So let's all right, let's go ahead and get started. And as I promised in previous videos, for those of you curious, today I'm wearing my Vostok Komandarski. So I've had this watch about 2 weeks now and highly recommend it. And it's a good caveat, or not a good caveat, a good add-on to this video, because for those of you that want to experience what a vintage watch feels like but want to have a newer piece, this watch feels this watch feels exactly like a vintage watch. It actually reminds me a lot of my vintage Pierce. They both use brass cases that are plated, and that's kind of the first point that I want to talk on. So when you buy a watch that's plated, and they'll use my Vostok here as a great example, this is something you're going to look out for on vintage pieces. When they were new, they looked like this Vostok. They looked like a stainless steel case, and they might actually lead you to believe that they're a stainless steel case. But what they are, most vintage pieces, not all, is they're plated cases. And so you can see here, we have, this is my vintage Pierce chronograph. Hopefully this will come into focus here. And hopefully what you can see is there's just this patina on the case where you can see that the coating is actually coming off of the case. Here is a better view there. So, when they were new, they were nice and they were shiny and they were pretty, but as vintage pieces, as your body, as you sweat and you get oils into them and they just get beaten up on desk and what have you, what you'll notice is that the finish will come off. And that's the first thing I think people just don't really expect on vintage pieces. People expect scrapes and scuffs, but I think the thing they don't realize is that a lot of vintage pieces, you're going to find this kind of patina to them because the finish will come off on any ones that were not solid stainless steel. And, is that a big deal? No. Is that something that should bother you? No. It's just something you should expect when you're buying a vintage piece. Another thing you might pick up on, and this watch is showing better on camera than it looks in person, is that the dials are not going to be perfect either. They're going to get a patina on them. I don't know if you can see up here at 12 o'clock, some of the numbering is coming off, some of the print on the ink on the dial is coming off. And that's just going to happen. You wear a watch in the sun for many years and they just get beaten up. You're just going to have to expect imperfections. It's kind of my first tip to anybody looking at a vintage watch. Is you're going to expect that they're not going to be perfect. That's kind of part of the charm. A watch like this has a story to tell. It's had a very long life with, if it could only talk about its previous experience, I can only imagine what this watch has seen. But don't expect a new watch, because you're not going to get a new watch. You're going to get a watch that's going to have scuffs and scrapes. The dial is going to have printing that's going to be coming off of it. This one's actually in pretty decent shape, but That's just kind of the way that it goes. And, you know, some of these watches, like this Pierce in particular, the biggest thing that I also want to warn people about is it can be very difficult to find parts for one of these guys. You know, vintage Rolexes, you know, they're pretty easy because they're pretty a well-supported watch, but something like this Pierce and any vintage watch I recommend you guys looking into, I'd recommend that you consider what kind of availability there is for parts and service. So this particular watch has a pretty complex movement. So here's a beautiful vintage watch movement, and this guy happens to be running. Apologize for the glare. But the thing you have to remember too is when if you're buying a vintage piece, especially one as complicated as this being a chronograph, is you may not be able to find parts to fix it. So when you're buying a watch, you know, especially one like this that is a rarer model, a Pierce is not one of the more common brands, and it's a highly sophisticated watch. Look for one that's in good running condition, because a movement like this, as you can see, has a bunch of parts in it, and to find spares for this movement is going to be substantially more difficult than it would be to find parts for, say, a vintage Omega, a Speedmaster. So just something to keep in mind. As you can see, this one is in phenomenal mechanical shape. You know, the case has some scuffs on it, but this watch would be a good vintage buy because it's a rarer watch and it'd be hard to find parts for, but as you can see, the movement is in meticulous shape. And that's something you really need to take into consideration, because if you were to find one of these watches that had a rough life, that it had not been maintained, and the movement was in rough shape, if it's running rough or if it's not even running at all, understand that finding parts to fix it and then finding a watchmaker with the expertise to put it back in working order can be a very difficult thing to do. And I can't count how many times I've seen listings for watches on eBay that say non-functioning. And the reason is the previous owner probably bought them that way and thought that they'd find somebody to fix it and ended up having to sell them on because they could not find anybody that would be able to fix them. So, you know, again, this watch is working great, but again, that's something you're going to want to look for. Any watch that you buy that's not in that great a shape, especially if the movement is running poorly or not running at all, bear in mind finding parts for it and finding somebody that can work on it can be extremely difficult. And, you know, another watch that kind of explains is, that kind of is captured on as well, is like this vintage Elgin. So this Elgin's from 1899. Elgin watches, Elgin pocket watches in general, are pretty common and they're not too hard to find. However, finding original pieces to, like the dial, for example, can be very difficult. So this watch has been fully serviced, it runs beautifully, and one of the things is the hands on this watch are not original. And to find original hands from 1899 for this watch that actually came on this watch is actually very difficult. The jeweler that restored this watch for me looked for several years to find original hands, and unfortunately he was unable to do so. So these are replacement hands. They look great, but finding all original pieces can be very difficult. And again, it's hard to see. This one has a pretty good dial, but this is a porcelain dial. You can see some aging as well on this guy as well, down here. But again, something else to be considered, even a watch as common as an Elgin, finding original hands for this guy turned out to be a major pain. Another thing to take in consideration, and this watch is a great example of, is are the watches economically feasible to repair? So this Elgin watch is probably worth between $200 and $300, and I spent $200 to restore it. So I am never going to get my money back out of this watch, and that's okay for me because this was a family heirloom, and I restored it because it's something that's significant to me. However, if you're going to buy a watch and then it's going to require substantial work, you should take into consideration whether or not putting that amount of money and effort and time into that watch is a good investment. And odds are there's quite a few pieces out there that they're not really worth fixing, unfortunately. It would be something you would do out of passion, but not something out of dollars and cents. So something else to keep in mind. You know, a couple other watches. Here's my vintage Tudor. The big deal with these guys, I won't get into these guys too much because this watch kind of deserves its own review, which I'll do at some point. There's a lot of replicas of these guys out there now, and if you're buying a vintage one of these Tudors, I'll have to do a video on this guy on its own. You got to be very careful that you're getting all original, authentic factory parts on that. So I'll have to remember to come back to that watch at some point. I have some vintage Seikos here as well. Now, some other great examples. I've talked about these watches before on my channel. This Seiko right here is a 7Z17 model. It's a 7006 series 7017. I bought this watch. This is an example of a good watch for somebody that's looking for a vintage watch. So I bought this watch for $5 on a no reserve auction. And this is a situation where there was a ton of parts out for these watches. So this watch was fortunately running pretty well, but these older watches have plastic acrylic crystals which are scratched up. And the reason I got this watch for such a good deal is the crystal was all really scratched up. And going on eBay, I was able to find a crystal that fit it perfectly. And since I know a little bit about watches, I was able to fit a new crystal to it, and it works great. So this is a situation where this watch would probably be a good buy for somebody because there's a ton of vintage Seikos for sale online, and finding parts for these series isn't that difficult. And if you're just looking at a particular model, if you find out what the model series is, and assuming they have original case back, like this guy does, 7006-7017, look up the model number and see what kind of part availability you can get online. This would be a great candidate for somebody that wants to get a vintage watch because they're actually pretty good, pretty easy to find parts for these guys. This is something that I think if you're looking for vintage watches, look for something like this where finding parts is not that difficult. Whereas something like this guy, this is my vintage Seiko speed timer, and this is the rare flyback. So you can see it's a flyback, and this guy is actually really rare. And so the deal with something like this guy is, well, two things. If the kanji date wheel didn't give it away, this was a Japanese market only watch. There's a couple that might go on sale on eBay of these guys globally in a year, and a lot of those are not running. So what does that tell you? That tells you that previous owners that had these watches, you know, may have bought them with the intent to restore them, and then decided that they were unable to do so. Speed timers are accumulating in value, they're appreciating in value, and there are some people out there dedicated to restoring them, but restoring a watch like this would not be one of the easier tasks. I mean, it's certainly possible, but it would take a lot of patience, and you would do yourself the best bet of just finding one that's in good shape, like this guy that's running well already. Buying a non-runner version of this watch, you might think getting it for a good price was a good deal, but it could take you a long time to find all the parts you need to complete it. It could be difficult to find somebody that's willing to work on it, and at the end of the day, it could be actually quite an expensive endeavor as you source little bits and pieces for these watches to make it worthwhile. This watch actually uses a glass crystal as well, which is in reasonably good shape. And as you can see too, again, this one, hopefully you can see on the camera, has a little bit of a patina as well. So this thing isn't going to have the luminescence of a new watch. The dial is going to be somewhat faded, and you can see the case is a little bit scratched up. This is a solid stainless steel case, but again, all things to take into consideration. So here's just a few of my pieces. I've owned a bunch of vintage watches, and here's kind of my general takeaway. If you like the look of a vintage piece, or you like the feel of a vintage piece, but you don't want to deal with, you know, having to find people that are able to work on it, and you kind of want the aesthetics of a new watch, go buy one of these. This is the most painless experience of owning a vintage watch. I kid you not, it feels extremely similar to a lot of these vintage pieces in terms of the way it's built. You know, plastic crystal, plated case, $30. This is a great way to get a vintage watch feel for not a lot of money. If you are serious about looking at vintage watches, a couple key points that should be takeaways for you. One, make sure that there's parts that are available for that watch. And one of the ways you can find out is look up the watch models on Google and look at watch forums. A lot of these vintage pieces have watch communities behind them that are very passionate about them. And so, you know, like there's a whole following online for Seiko speed timers. And you could look up, you know, Seiko 7017-8000 and find some good information on this watch in particular if you wanted to. And so figure out what kind of community is out there, what kind of support you can get. You know, are parts available? Are people out there willing to work on them? And are they economically feasible to repair? You know, if a watch like this is worth $300 or $400 in stellar shape, and it's going to cost you, you know, $100 for a non-runner and then another couple $100 to put it back into running order, is that a good investment for you? Is that something you want to deal with? You know, again, too, remember that these watches, a lot of them have plastic crystals. These things get scuffed up. They are not as tough as a new sapphire crystal watch would be, and if you bang this into a wall a couple times, you're going to break the crystal. You know, again, be aware too that a lot of these old watches have plated cases. You know, these watches that had a stainless look, again, a lot of them are plated brass. Also, you'll find a lot of gold plated cases out there. Stay away from those as well. Gold plated cases, they're going to peel just like this, and honestly, they have zero resale. If you're going to buy anti-vintage watch, I would avoid anything that's been plated. If you can't get a stainless steel case, then I guess if you want to get something like this, it was like a brass plated with a stainless overlay, like a look overlay, that's fine, but stay away from gold plated cases. Nobody wants them. They're all going to peel off and they have like zero value and they're not worth any kind of investment. So very long-winded, but that's kind of my takeaway. Buy something with a good online community and good support. Make sure you can get parts. Make sure you're comfortable with what kind of investment it's going to take from you. And my last big thing too is remember that vintage watches are smaller than they are today. So this was considered a full-size chronograph back in the day, and I don't have a newer watch for comparison next to me, but you know, that Shinola Brakeman I just did is basically the size of this Elgin. So watches have gotten considerably bigger, so let's just assume this is my Shinola. As you can see, watch sizes have changed quite a bit. So this is just under 40, I think it's about 47 millimeters. If this was an actual wristwatch, well, this is right about 41 mil. So this is fine, but as you can see, or maybe you can on this well, older watches are small. Like one of my mistakes was not realizing this early on, and I bought a couple of vintage watches, like a Jaeger-LeCoultre that was 32 millimeters, and it looked like a woman's watch to me, and I sold it within a couple of weeks because I just thought it was too small to wear. So that too, just make sure that the size of the watch is something that you'd be willing to live with. If you have questions on watch sizes, look on my video I put up on that. So again, apologize, not one of my better videos, I'm all over the place, but those are kind of my takeaways. It's such a broad topic, but stay away from plated cases, look for a good running watch, make sure you're comfortable with the kind of capital outlay it's going to require, and you know, that's kind of my takeaways. And also remember too that they're fragile. They're going to have plastic crystals, they're not going to have the shock resistance of a newer watch, and you know, you can't bang this thing around as much as you could, say, like a new Seiko Monster, for example. So hopefully this was helpful. Sorry that I was all over the place and kind of long-winded. It's kind of a hard topic for me to discuss because I feel like there's just so many variables to it. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Please comment, rate, and subscribe.